Fuel's low. Visibility's 0. She won't make it. Everyone expected the Blackhawk to never return, but when the landing gear touched down, the medical team broke into tears. She kept them alive the entire flight. Who was that woman? And why did the entire base have to rewrite their evacuation protocols after her journey? Type, she did it, if you believe the greatest flights are the ones nobody thought possible. Chloe Arnett was 32 years old and professionally invisible at Forward Operating Base. Talon, she existed in the margins of military hierarchy. A former combat pilot who had rejoined the service after 3 years in civilian life. She was assigned to transport operations, the unglamorous work of moving supplies and personnel between safe zones. She didn't demand attention, spoke only when necessary, wore regulation flight suits that somehow made her blend into the background of any room she entered. The other pilots frequently mistook her for a new medic or administrative clerk. Her quiet confidence was interpreted as inexperience. Her careful preparation dismissed as overcautiousness. When base Talon was placed on high alert due to an ambush at Charlie Line, the flight commander selected his emergency response team exclusively from the male pilot roster. Chloe wasn't even considered for the briefing. Lieutenant Morrison, fresh from flight school, with 6 months of desert experience, laughed when he saw her studying weather patterns near the ready room that Blackhawk isn't for practice. "Runs, sweetheart. Maybe you should stick to water deliveries." Chloe said nothing. She folded her hand-drawn topographical map back into her flight jacket pocket, a map marked with 2 alternative emergency routes she'd identified during countless hours studying terrain features that others ignored. The flight commanders didn't ask for her input. They assumed that female pilots weren't suited for life and death missions in conditions approaching zero visibility. Their experience had taught them that transport operations require different skills than combat extraction. They were wrong, but Chloe didn't waste energy, correcting assumptions that wouldn't change minds. What they didn't know was that Chloe's transport background included classified missions in Afghanistan, where she learned to navigate by sound, wind patterns, and instinct. When all electronic systems failed, she'd mastered techniques that weren't taught in the standard flight school skills developed during emergencies that officially never happened. Her flight jacket contained more than regulation equipment, hidden pockets, held backup. Navigation tools, emergency frequency charts, and hand-copied procedures for flying in conditions that would ground most pilots. But she kept these capabilities to herself. Experience had taught her that proving expertise often mattered less than fitting expectations, better to be underestimated and useful than recognized and reassigned to missions that would separate her from the work she actually cared about, while the selected pilots prepared for standard extraction protocols. Chloe continued her quiet preparation for the emergency she sensed was coming. She rechecked weather data, updated her alternative route calculations, and performed the kind of thorough pre-flight analysis that survival demanded someone would need help soon. And when that moment came, preparation would matter more than recognition type. Unfair? If you've seen skilled people excluded because of prejudice, the distress call came at 13:47 hours, cutting through routine radio chatter like a scream. Mayday, Mayday, Phoenix down, coordinates uncertain. 7 Marines injured, require immediate evacuation, weather closing fast. Blackhawk 274 had been shot down during a reconnaissance mission near the jungle border. 7 Marines were wounded, trapped in terrain so remote that GPS couldn't establish precise coordinates. Storm systems were moving in from 3 directions, creating a weather convergence that would make flying suicidal within hours. The command center erupted into controlled chaos. Maps appeared on tables. Weather data scrolled across screens. Radio operators tried desperately to re-establish contact with the downed crew. 2 senior flight teams reviewed the mission parameters and reached the same conclusion. Impossible fuel requirements exceed safe margins by 40%, reported Chief Pilot Martinez. Visibility will be 0 by the time we reach the target zone. No guaranteed landing site, no emergency fallback position. Captain Williams, the flight operations commander, studied the tactical display. With the expression of someone calculating acceptable losses, weather window is already closing. he said. Finally, we can't risk additional aircraft and crew for a mission with less than 20% success probability. That's when Chloe stepped forward from her position near the communications station. Sir, I volunteer for the mission. The command center fell silent. Officers turned to stare at the woman they'd barely noticed during months of routine operations. Captain Williams looked confused. Arnett, your transport. This requires combat extraction experience. I have combat extraction experience, sir. Where Afghanistan classified operations, I can provide details if necessary. Chloe approached the tactical display, her movements confident and precise. She pulled out her hand-drawn map, spreading it beside the official charts. I've identified 2 alternative approach routes that avoid the main weather systems. Both require low-level flying through terrain features that aren't on standard navigation charts. Chief Engineer Thompson studied her annotations with growing interest. How do you know about these canyon passages? I study topographical patterns during downtime. These routes were used by indigenous populations for generations before military mapping. The terrain provides natural windbreaks and radar shadows, but you'd still be flying blind in near-zero visibility. Martinez objected. Chloe nodded calmly. I've trained in acoustic navigation echolocation techniques for flying in conditions where instruments fail. It's an old skill, but it works. The room remained skeptical until communications specialist Rodriguez spoke up. Sir, she's been studying our emergency frequency protocols for months. Last week, she asked me about low-frequency signal propagation in heavy weather. Captain Williams looked at Chloe with new attention. Why weren't these skills noted in your service record? Because the missions where I use them don't exist in official records, sir. The weight of classified operations hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood the implications of skills, learned during missions that couldn't be discussed. Colonel Gerard entered the command center, having been briefed on the situation. During his approach, he studied the weather data, the mission parameters, and the volunteer standing beside charts that showed impossible routes through impossible terrain. Arnett, he said quietly, if you die attempting this, I'll be court-martialed for authorizing a suicide mission. Chloe met his gaze without flinching. And if I succeed, sir, if you succeed, I'll rewrite our emergency extraction protocols to include everything you've just shown us. She nodded once, accepting both the risk and the responsibility. 7 Marines are waiting, sir. With respect, discussion time is over. Colonel Gerard stared at her for 10 seconds that felt like hours, weighing duty against prudence, courage against acceptable risk. Get her aircraft ready, he ordered, and God help us all. Chloe lifted off at 15:23 hours alone in Blackhawk 847, flying into weather conditions that should have grounded all aircraft within minutes. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. Rain lashed the windscreen with tropical intensity. Wind shears threatened to tear the rotor system apart at every altitude. Change standard navigation failed immediately. GPS signals disappeared into electronic static radio communications, became intermittent whispers consumed by atmospheric interference. But Chloe had prepared for exactly these conditions. She dropped to 60 feet above the canopy and began flying by sound and intuition, using techniques she'd learned during classified missions that had required approaching targets without triggering electronic detection systems. The engine noise told her about air density. The way the aircraft responded to control inputs revealed wind patterns invisible to instruments. The sound of rotors bouncing off terrain features created an acoustic map more reliable than any GPS system. 27 minutes into the flight, she heard it, the distant sound of artillery fire, mixed with the electronic squeal of emergency beacon transmission. The downed Marines were broadcasting on multiple frequencies, trying to guide rescue aircraft to their position. Chloe adjusted course toward the sound, flying through canyons that official maps claimed didn't exist. Her hand-drawn charts proved accurate, natural wind corridors that provided relatively stable flight paths through otherwise impossible terrain. She found them at the bottom of a ravine that looked like a helicopter graveyard. Blackhawk 274 lay on its side, smoke rising from damaged engines. 7 figures moved around the wreckage, waving frantically at the sound of approaching rotors. Landing was the next impossibility. The ravine floor was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen trees, no flat. Surface large enough for a Blackhawk, no room for error. Chloe performed what pilots call a pinnacle landing setting. The aircraft down on terrain that violates every safety protocol. She used the slope of the ravine wall to help absorb the impact, touched one skid to solid ground while keeping the other suspended, and held the aircraft in position through pure control inputs. While the Marines loaded their wounded, the most critically injured Marine Corporal Williams had stopped breathing during the transfer. Chloe could see the medic performing CPR in her peripheral vision while she prepared for takeoff. "He's back," the medic shouted over rotor noise, weak pulse. But breathing, Chloe lifted off with a technique she learned during an emergency extraction in Kandahar, using the ground effect and rotor wash to literally bounce the aircraft off the ravine walls until she gained enough altitude to clear the rim. The return flight became a race against time and physics, overloaded with casualties and medical equipment. The Blackhawk flew at the absolute edge of its performance envelope. Every gust of wind threatened to stall the rotors. Every course correction required more power than the engines could sustain for extended periods. But Chloe had calculated these margins during her pre-flight planning. She knew exactly how much punishment the aircraft could absorb, exactly which shortcuts through the train would save critical minutes, exactly when to risk everything on a single decision. 38 minutes after takeoff, Base Talon's medical team saw rotating lights approaching through the storm. The Blackhawk's emergency strobes cut through rain and darkness like a beacon of impossible success. Chloe set the aircraft down harder than regulation allowed, but with precision that placed the cargo door exactly where the medical team needed it before the rotors stopped spinning. Medics were carrying wounded Marines toward the trauma center. 6 of the 7 Marines were conscious and stable. The 7th, Corporal Williams, had a pulse that grew stronger. With each passing minute, Chloe shut down the engines and sat in the pilot seat for several seconds, her hands still gripping the controls, rain drumming against the windscreen. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow, leaving her shaking from exhaustion and relief when she finally climbed out of the aircraft. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat and rain. Her eyes showed the strain of 43 minutes spent flying in conditions that shouldn't allow survival. She didn't speak to the medical team rushing past her, didn't acknowledge the ground crew who stared at her like she just returned from the dead. She simply walked toward the debriefing room where Colonel Gerard was waiting with questions that would reshape how the military thought about impossible missions and the pilots capable of flying them. 1 week later, there was no grand ceremony or media attention. Instead, a small note appeared on the flight operations bulletin board: mission 847, completed by sole female pilot, 7 lives, preserved under impossible conditions. Colonel Gerard didn't call a press conference. He did something more meaningful. He walked into the advanced tactical flight classroom and introduced a new case study. The Arnett situation, he announced to 30 flight students, when skill becomes the only compass that matters. The case study wasn't about heroism or exceptional courage. It was about preparation, technical expertise, and the kind of professional confidence that turns impossible missions into successful operations. Chloe's hand-drawn maps became required study materials. Her acoustic navigation techniques were added to the emergency procedures manual. Her approach to flying in zero visibility conditions became standard training for all combat pilots. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. A group of young Marines began wearing small metal pins shaped like Blackhawk helicopters, discreet tributes they called Chloe's Angels. The symbol spread through the base, not as official recognition, but as grassroots acknowledgement of someone who had proven that competence transcends gender assumptions. Lieutenant Morrison, who had mocked her abilities just days earlier, approached Chloe in the maintenance hangar with something approaching reverence. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology and an explanation. I've never seen flying like that." Chloe looked up from her post-flight inspection checklist. "You don't owe me anything, Lieutenant. You owe those 7 Marines the promise that you'll be ready when someone needs you." She didn't request promotion or special recognition. Instead, she made one simple proposal permission to teach a weekend course in classical navigation techniques for pilots who wanted to expand their emergency capabilities just in case someone needs these skills. Someday, she explained to Colonel Gerard, the course became the most popular elective training on base, not because it was required, but because every pilot understood they were learning. From someone who had proven these techniques under conditions where failure meant death. Chloe returned to her regular transport duties, but everything had changed. Pilots sought her advice before difficult missions, ground crews studied her maintenance procedures. Flight planners consulted her alternative route recommendations. She remained quiet, professional, and focused on the work rather than the recognition. But now her expertise was visible to those who understood what they were seeing. The base motto was quietly updated to reflect their new understanding. Excellence. Flies without permission. Courage serves without condition. Lives are saved by those who prepare for impossible moments. Corporal Williams, the Marine who had briefly stopped breathing during the rescue, sent Chloe a handwritten note. "Thank you for not giving up when everyone else had already counted us out," type. "I will remember if you believe one right action can rewrite entire systems." Chloe Arnett didn't need newspaper headlines or television interviews. She didn't fly for fame or recognition. She flew because 7 people were waiting for someone to believe the impossible was merely difficult. And that was enough. Today's story isn't just about survival. It's about the quiet confidence that exists all around us, waiting for the moment when preparation meets desperate need. How many Chloe Arnetts work in your organization? People whose skills are overlooked because they don't fit conventional expectations, whose expertise is dismissed because they don't demand attention, whose capabilities remain hidden until crisis reveals their true value. We live in a world that often mistakes confidence for confidence, volume for value. We notice the people who promote themselves while overlooking those who simply deliver results. When it matters most, Chloe's story reminds us that the most reliable people are often the quietest ones. The colleagues who study procedures, others ignore the team members who prepare for scenarios others consider impossible. The individuals who measure success not by recognition received, but by responsibilities fulfilled. The next time someone seems too quiet or not leadership material, remember Chloe Arnett flying through a storm to reach people she'd never met, guided only by skill preparation and the unshakable belief that 7 lives were worth any risk. Subscribe Iron Heart Stories. If you believe the humble ones often save the team.